this might be like a commonplace, but I think that there's a certain degree of blindness in everything that one does. There's a blind spot. That means that one does not have a very clear idea of why one is doing or how one's own work is progressing. One doesn't do one's own work like a general overseeing a battle from top of a hill. One is really in the thick of it. And in that sense, there are certain things about one's own work that one doesn't control, that one doesn't, or that I don't control and I don't fully understand. Having said this, I would say that I think there are two main tendencies in literature in Latin America from people of my generation. On one hand, there are some people that are very literary, very influenced by Borges, and on the other hand, there are some writers that are more, I would say, professionally modern, that talk about things that are very close to pop culture and very referential in terms of their own, the culture where they live. And even though I could be placed closer to the first tendency, I actually feel, even though I don't belong to any of these two categories, I in many ways feel closer to the second one, to the Macondo writers, as they are called, after Fuguet and Gomez's famous book. And basically the reason that I feel closer to them is because of a similar interest in the zeitgeist, in the spirit of the times, even though these people are exploring the zeitgeist, as it were, from inside. And I have a very different kind of interest in that kind of sensibility, but still I am preoccupied in some of my writings with that, even though, as I'm saying, from a very different perspective, actually from a historical perspective, from looking at it from very far away and how it changes. But nonetheless, I feel closer to those people even in that generational sense, even though I would say that I don't fully belong to any of those two categories. The other people that are more literary do a kind of literature that it's about literature in many ways, and I don't share some of the ideas about literature, some of those ideas of some of those people. Now, talking more specifically about my work and about my works, my first novel, which was called El Invasor, was a historical novel, and it talked about the true case of a Spanish worker called Antonio Ramon, whose brother died in a famous massacre in 1907 in northern Chile, in Iquique, and he attempted, quite pathetically, to kill the general who gave the order 7 years after the killing, after the massacre. And my novel reconstructs as fiction his trip in the north of Chile, among the minefields of the time, searching for his brother after his brother has gone missing, and still when he doesn't know that he has been killed in that massacre. My second novel, Movimiento Falso, takes place in a similar landscape in the desert in the north of Chile, but it takes place in contemporary times, I guess in the late 1990s. And it is, I was preoccupied in this novel with a place called Pisagua, this small town in the north of Chile, which is in ruins in a very spectacular landscape. But this was a place where there were several concentration camps, the most notorious one in 1973-74, at the beginning of the military dictatorship of Pinochet. And this is a place where you can feel a really bad vibe in the atmosphere. And I was interested in this sort of black holes, these places with really negative energy that seem to be almost like the shadow of something more luminous or something lighter and brighter in certain societies. I lived in San Francisco for several years, and in many ways Alcatraz plays the same role there. It's funny that such a beautiful place as a prison and a place of pain and torture. And I don't see it from a humorless point of view, but it's interesting to me that this place would be the main touristic attraction of the city. I had the same sensation traveling through Vietnam, in certain areas of Vietnam where you can feel the pain that happen in those places, as it almost it is physically present there. And so I was interested in this town Pisagua, and the novel is the story of this old, relatively old, eccentric businessman who's very rich and who decides to retire, abandon his family, and settle in Pisagua, which is a place that everybody would want to get out of. And he goes there and tries to establish a project of life, and he builds a house. And it's told from the point of view of a young character who's somewhat hired by his family to go and observe him, spy on him, but they become friends, and the novel is really the history of this friendship. Then in many ways it's a relationship of mentorship, even though a little crazy, but still they establish almost a master-disciple relationship. And my last novel is called La Calma. It has not been published, it's still manuscript. And it takes place also in a very empty landscape, even though it's not the desert in the north of Chile. And it is, I was inspired on certain historical events that took place in the Argentinian Patagonia at the turn of the century, but I don't name it. I don't name that it's Argentina, I don't name what time exactly it is, but it was the fact that certain outlaws, American outlaws, escaped to Patagonia and tried to carry out their business down there, and they were for a brief period of time persecuted by a small army of vigilantes. And I turned this in the novel into a small McCarthyian hysteria process, but without naming the place. And it's basically the story of this character who has a task, a duty, which consists in bringing a small girl who's has some kind of mental problem from point A to point B. He has this duty, and he's willing to sacrifice himself and ultimately self-destruct to pursue it. But basically I tied this with this persecution of outlaws, of foreigners that could be taken as outlaws just because of being foreigners, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It is in many ways a Western, or it has a little bit of that genre, I would say. And well, that's basically what I can say of my work. I must insist again that I think there are elements of it that are not clear once you are creating it. I have the feeling that with these 3 novels, I've sort of completed a trilogy, a cycle that has in common the landscape. The landscape has been very important. This empty landscape has been the inspiration for these projects. And I have the feeling that I will be pursuing something somewhat different from now on,